We wait just a second because I can see everyone filling up the panelist bar.
And it's really great to have Scott join us right at the top of the hour. Thanks, Scott.
He has to make an entrance.
Yes.
We had a little technical glitch that got all our blood pumping, Scott.
That's why I have the haircut that I do, Shimo. I can get right in at the last minute without having to have any prep. It helps.
Awesome. That's awesome.
All right, everyone. I'm Terry Roberts. It's so great to have you today for our webinar. We did a little practice session, and Junior called this room nights as a measure, not the measure. And I think that should have been our title. So Junior, thanks for that. And I'll introduce our panelists who that makes it an easy job for me because they kind of need no introduction. First, Junior Taba, who's the Chief Sales Officer in Visit Anaheim. Scott Beck, the President and CEO of Destination Toronto. And then my boss lady and my friend, Shimo. Welcome, everyone. It's so nice to have you. And we're going to take a little bit different format today. We thought that we would begin by asking you to kind of hold your questions because we anticipate there's going to be a lot of them. And we think as we move through the content of the webinar and talk about this whole metrics of DMO value proposition and moving away from room nights as the sole metrics, that many of them will get answered, but we look forward to a really engaging Q&A with Junior, Scott, and Shimo at the end. So before we get started, we thought that we would like to just address some distinctions, three particular distinctions that might set the stage for our discussion. So I'm going to kick it over to Junior to first talk about the language, the nomenclature that we use when we talk about room nights.
I think that's Scott.
All right, Scott, so sorry.
Don't worry. I think you'll find out that Junior and I, we could be interchangeable. I think we both feel the same about all of this stuff.
Right.
But Shimo will make us sound relevant. That's the key here. I think I guess I would start by saying I think we have an unprecedented opportunity right now as we talk about the impact of the pandemic and what it's meant. There's a lot of hotel rooms that never left our market. They're all empty, and there's no people in them. There's no attendees, delegates, visitors. And I think this moment has really showcased and brought to life the impact of what we really do, and that is bring people to our communities. So as we talk about sort of nomenclature, there's a lot of discussion around this. And I know many of you know how I feel about the lexicon that our trade association has introduced. I feel equally as passionate about the nomenclature we use around the quantification of our impact. And I think adopting a nomenclature that is aligned with our key stakeholders, and that's not just the hotel community, but our key stakeholders within our community will help really drive home the real impact of what we're doing and the real importance of using the attendee as that benchmark of impact. And again, as Terry noted, this isn't about not tracking room nights, but it's about elevating the individual, the person, the true impactor to the economy to the forefront of our efforts, and then using that attendee to then calculate things like room nights and other measures of impact. And I think, again, this is epitomized to me very briefly in a conversation that I had around this term that we use in our industry called overnight attendee. I'll never forget the look of sheer befuddlement on the face of one of our locally elected officials when I talked about overnight attendees. And he looked at me like, what does that mean? And somehow this idea that we qualify attendee in ways that to him just didn't make sense. Economic development, they don't quantify the term jobs as, jobs for people who don't live here, or it's jobs. And we have a similar way, I believe, to define the role of attendee as a basis of calculation for so many of our efforts. And again, I think it is so impactful as it relates to value. And while I'm not trying to say that this nomenclature is a shared community value, I think it puts us at the table of economic development in a way that will be entirely relevant and helpful to our goals to become a shared community value.
And I think to build on that, one of the things that we look at as our destination is the total impact of an event to our destination, right? So we talk a lot about room nights, right? But that's just one piece of the equation, right? The other part of the equation is all of this, as Scott talked about, the impact of all of these attendees that are coming into our destinations, whether that's to the transportation side of the business, the restaurant side of the business, and certainly the hotel side, right? And so this is a big topic that we're about to sort of take on, right? And some of the theories and some of the actions that we're talking about could be applied across all of our business, right? But I think for this discussion, we want to sort of make the focus or take the focus really around the citywide business, and we refer to as the convention side of the business, and that's where we're going to try to keep most of our conversation. It could mean that later on, Shimo has to do another webinar to really focus on the meetings or the self-contained side of the business. But I think for the purpose of this, we're really going to try to stay on the convention or the citywide side of the business.
If I could, Shimo, just jump in 1 second on that. And I think all of you know, I take great pride in establishing the fact that I'm a recovering hotelier. But I also will say
still after all these years, Scott,
I've got my chip. It's now a 17-year chip, but I still have my chip. It is really an important distinction that Junior brings home, and I think we can hopefully clarify that as we move through.
And I think though, if you look at the concepts, because everyone on the webinar today doesn't necessarily have a convention center, or their focus is certainly not citywide conventions, but you do deal with multiple hotel events and sporting events and other types of markets. And I think that fundamentally, though, this conversation is going to apply to those events as well. So, the other, I think, distinction that we'll make is that, there's a difference between how we use our metrics. So whether it's attendance or whether it's room nights, these, you could use them for performance metrics or goals, but then we should also think about how we're applying these metrics to strategy or for key performance indicators that help you monitor progress towards your goal. So we want to make that differentiation too, that the one size fits all certainly does come into play here, because definite room nights certainly has been a predominant metric in our industry. And judging by some of the results we had from the CEO organization and performance study we conducted, and the sales incentive study that we conducted several years ago, room nights has been the most predominant metric. So we want to have us think about that one size certainly doesn't fit all. So I think let's get into what is this webinar about. The webinar we call, Are You Ready to Move Away from the Sole Focus on Room Nights? So one, I think we want to address, what is the problem? Okay, so let's talk about what the problem. And then let's address what are our alternatives. And then thirdly, how do we get our stakeholders engaged and supportive and bought in? So those are the three areas that we'll tackle in today's webinar. So let's start it off with the problem. So let me point first to Scott, with the bigger picture about this problem that you alluded to, when you're addressing the nomenclature that we use.
I think the biggest problem is that the room night doesn't validate the biggest impact that we have in our community. And that impact, by any research that I have seen, is so much larger than the impact of the hotel community. We just recently did a study of the impact of COVID. The single biggest area of our economy that was impacted by the loss of visitors was the retail sector, not the hotel sector. And the hotel sector was third, followed by food and beverage. And so what the room night, this preponderance on room night, clearly leans into an enormously strategic connection to the hotel community. I get that. Again, recovering hotelier. I was on the board asking how many room nights did you produce? I understand that, but it is really not an effort that should be put forward in its current role as the metric. And I think that's the biggest problem, Shimo, is it just does not accurately portray the impact that we bring, and that ecosystem that we support within our community, and the long tail impact on the overall economy of our community is not reflected in the term and the preponderance of benchmarking around room nights.
And there's been some erosion to
Mhm.
that metric. So Junior, talk to us about the trackability.
Yeah, as you said and Scott said, I think room night has been a metric that we use to measure our success for decades. Maybe, as Scott said, maybe even over 100 years, right? It certainly has been, and since I got into this industry, right? The challenge that I see is technology has changed the marketplace dramatically, right? Technology has empowered the user, and our users have access to our inventory, right? They have access, and they not only access but choices now, right? So if we look at just the life cycle and what we've been experiencing in the marketplace, like the way we watch movies is not the same anymore, right? We stream a lot of our movies. The way that we consume transportation, Uber has changed that, right? Vacation for all of us in this space has also changed. Whether we go with Airbnb or go direct to the hotels, or even use the CVB's website, technology has given the user a lot more access, right? And empowered the user to make choices. And so in the past, when a convention is in place, you have to go one channel, right? You go to your housing, and that's how you get to the rooms. Right now, a consumer can get on a plane, come to a convention, and book their room while they're on that flight, right? So I think the technology has changed that, but we haven't changed as organizations in terms of how we measure our success or the metrics that we use to measure our success. I think the other piece, if you look at it from hotels, even hotels have changed, right? Before, as Scott talked about, it was all about room nights. Now, for many of us that have major convention centers, food and beverage is another qualifier before you can get rooms, right? So I've often had conversation with hotels that say, I'll give you this block, Junior, if the client can guarantee X amount of room, food and beverage to my hotel, right? So I think things have changed, so we need to sort of evolve with that.
So I think that, also the problem with room nights has been that it's a horrible predictor of the future in terms of, only solely looking at that one metric. So you could have a major event, in a future period, and it looks rosy. And you take that assumption that your success for a future year is going to be awesome. So when you just look at room nights, it's a horrible, what I would consider a key performance indicator. So I think that what you've said, Scott, about the bigger picture and it defining our value, and Junior, the fact that, we know that rooms around the block is a predominant practice. In fact, the latest study indicated nearly 1 out of every 2 citywide room nights are being booked outside the contracted room block. And I think we've all experienced this to some degree, where you see that your attendance is growing for future years, but guess what else is happening, right? The decrease in your requested rooms or your contracted room block. So, so now I guess, Scott and Junior, it really begs the question as to what should we use, and what is the recommendation, and what is your experience in using some alternate metrics? So Junior, let me start with what you're doing.
Yeah, so as you talked about, so we have a lot of metrics that we're tracking. And again, room night is one of the metrics that we track, right? So for us, the number of events, right, or bookings is a critical metric that we look at. The economic impact of that, of those definite rooms or definite groups is another metric that we look at. And similar to what hotels track, right, we also have crossover goals, things like how business are rated, right? A-rated business versus B-rated business. I could talk more about that, right? Short-term business versus, long further out business is what we also look at to track our production and what we're looking at in terms of our success, right? The other piece that we also look at is who the audience that we're talking to. So if we're talking to hoteliers, right, rooms revenue, food and beverage are very important things that we track, right? If we're talking to a city officials, and it's more of economic impact and the number of events, attendance becomes a big metric that we talk about, as Scott talked about, both to the hotels and then to the city, but also a lot of our other businesses, restaurants, transportation companies, right? Those are metrics that are important to them. So for us, it's not about just one metric, it's all of the metric that makes the event, that represents the event, and allows us to really do the valuation, a correct valuation of that piece of business.
I mean, I'll just double down on what Junior's saying. I think, and Shimo, I remember, I mean, I can almost remember like it was yesterday when I sat in front of, our board and I said, every indicator we have is that all of our impacts are growing. Attendance, hotel revenue, food and beverage revenue, transportation, and yet the major sort of pillar of our organization is on a decline, and that is group room nights in the meetings and conventions area. And so it was fairly, I think, simple for us to get to this idea that we all can establish the value by attendee. So that a attendee that comes for a sporting event versus an attendee that comes for a life sciences conference versus an attendee that comes for a predominantly consumer show. It's very easy to use a lot of data that our stakeholders have. And I'll give you one specific example that led us to where we got to. And I think John Cycle just noted this in the chat. People would say, well, I didn't participate in that group in that convention because I didn't have a group room block. I could grab the STAR report and show compression and say, when I was over 5,000 people in the convention center, this is how your hotel 17 miles away from the convention center benefited from that group. You didn't have a block, but your rate was up by 22%, your occupancy was up by 11, and that's called compression. And so what we began to look at was if you can establish, and we can, all of us have this ability, single hotel, citywide conventions, we understand the predisposition of a guest, of an attendee, how far they travel, what type of business that they're in. And what we were able to do was extrapolate out to say, here's the sort of the highest value attendee. Not that one attendee is better than the other. It's sort of that old adage that there's no bad business, it's just the wrong business at the wrong time. So it's kind of that attitude that all attendees are not equal, but that doesn't mean that one attendee is better than the other. And so as we look to communicate the strategy, it was really based around finding alignment so that we knew when we were talking about attendees in the life sciences or medical association, we knew what that impact was going to be. And the long tail impact of that was one we began to have a narrative around, was that this is future workforce development. This is all those things that we know happen from a convention, not just the room nights, but it's who's in our community. And then we began to build the ecosystem around evaluating that. So building in ways to say, this guest has this type of attendee has a preponderance to share rooms of a certain factor. And these are all easily accessible information because we can get that from a housing authority. We can get these from very valid and also validatable resources. And so we really built a way to communicate the value of attendee and then what they would contribute, what room nights they would contribute through room demand, not just contracted room block, but it was really what the room demand was going to be created. And then what was the ancillary benefit of the types of events that we had? And what was the impact from an economic perspective by those various visitors? And through that segmentation that is so much a part of our major stakeholders, hotels segment very well. And I think we could really learn from that segmentation how we speak to them. That just like the way they segment their sort of perspective and strategies, we do the same. So really, Shima, it was about really finding those points that we could connect with around this metric that allowed us to then talk about room nights, because we used the attendee and the type of attendee to dictate what their room demand is going to be and how many room nights are going to generate, and then find sources to validate that and corroborate our perspective.
So, I think underlying to both Scott and Junior's perspective and where do we go, what metrics do we use, is, points to a lot of data. And I think that we definitely are in the world of more data, and our stakeholders are certainly analyzing and really digging deep into the analytics around an event and the impact of that event. So, Junior, what kind of tools are you using to help you sort of convey the message?
Yeah, so for us, economic impact was an important factor, right, or an important metric for us. So we use DI's economic calculator to evaluate for a couple of reasons. We looked at creating our own economic impact calculator, but it felt more validated for us, and maybe that's not the right term, but it felt we wanted to go with a third-party entity to do that, right? And so we worked a lot with credibility, right? We worked a lot with DI to localize, if you will, their economic calculator to our needs, right? And based on segmentation of business, as Scott talked about, right? So that was important for us, so that the calculator for an association versus a corporate piece of business is very different, right? So that's how we were able, and that's the metric again that we use to communicate out the value of of the business that we're bringing into the convention center for us, as well to our stakeholders, especially on the city side of our business.
And Scott, are there any other tools that you're using or methods? I think you mentioned you're making a calculation, right?
Yeah, I would say the most transformative data point that we used in this whole thing was a zip code sort of addresses by actualized attendees.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and there is not a citywide event that I'm aware of that does not have that number. Now, their ability or inclination to share that with you is completely different. I'm not advocating they'll all willingly share that with you, but I would also dare say that, I don't want to say regretfully, but the reality is, in a lot of our world, the DMO is a checkbook for the planner, and they want our financial resources to aid in their choosing our destination. That creates an enormous amount of leverage. So we were able to leverage our various and the sundry incentive offers to leverage that information. And what we found was it was even hyper relevant if it wasn't our destination. We could look at the National Sheriff's Association in Baltimore, and they would say this was our zip code sort, and we could look at 150 miles around Baltimore and see what they drew from Baltimore. And there were lessons to be learned, and you can develop rhythms that absolutely are great indicators of what future impact's going to be. And so that was the most transformational piece that we had, because then we were able to build profiles based on these different attendees. So we could then, within this spreadsheet that I think many on this call have seen or I've shared with them, we have the ability to assign a value to the attendee, and that value then pushes out metrics like room night production, like F&B, AV at the facility, number of attendees per convention center day. Those are all things that our convention center knows X amount of revenue per day, and they can define down by attendee what the revenue per day is. It's been almost eerie, the universality of attendee. And again, as a recovering hotel, you're just, I know we're not going to go down that path, but the metric for the BEO is people. It's the number of attendees. Right. We all have this, and yet we seem to feel it's elusive in the way we can extrapolate out the impact. And I think that is where the individual nature and the relevance has to be defined really locally. Because I know that Junior and I have been in this business, again, feels like 100 years, but even our organizations don't count room nights the same way. A definite room night to Junior is not a definite room night in my community. But yet how we get there based on the impact of the attendee, I think is absolutely achievable.
Yeah, and to sort of build on what Scott is talking about. So one of the things that we did is exactly what Scott talked about, is we went through and picked, right, so different sorts of conventions that are coming in, whether that's corporate, medical, association, all of those things. And we did intercept surveys, right? We also got from their organizers, the zip code of all of the attendees. And it was, didn't give us names or anything like that. It was the ID number and then a zip code, right? And so we did exactly what Scott did and looked at that to aggregate and get to the economic impact. Then we compared that to what the DI calculator did, right? And then from there, we started to adjust that calculator to make sure it aligns with what we're looking at. And we've been doing that I think we do that every 3 years, is look at that and look at our annuals. And what we found, in addition to that, is the number of people, as Scott talked about, the number of people that are coming in for those and the impact to more beyond just the contracted hotels, right? The compression, as Scott talked about, was beyond what we even thought, and what we valued that piece of business from a room night perspective, right? So that's a great exercise for us. It's an exercise that we shared with our hotels, right? And again, moved them along in this process.
So, one of the tools too that is accessible to the DMOs is certainly the overnight room demand analyzer, another tool of Destinations International. So that's a zip code analysis. Even though, Scott, you may cringe a little bit on the name of it as overnight room demand. But that was done before.
What other kind of room demand is there? There's only one kind of room demand. It's overnight. It's just redundant is all I'm saying.
It should have just been RTA, right?
Exactly.
And so, but we named that back in the day before we had the benefit of hearing and listening to Scott's wisdom. So I want to go into this last question, which is, how can the DMOs on the call today really get the buy-in of their stakeholders and move into a direction? So let me first start with you, Scott, about how you got stakeholder buy-in as a recovering hotelier.
Well, I would like to start and advocate for a grassroots effort to require our industry trade association to help us get there. We need more things like this. We need more education. We need our trade association, we need our industry, and we need all of the providers of platforms and technology to step up as well. I will say there was two transformational sort of opportunities we had, and I think that these can be replicated. I recognize the privilege I had to be there during these conversations, and the organic nature of them is hyper relevant to what I experienced, but I think they can be replicated. One was clients. We had clients saying, I'm bringing more attendings to your destination every freaking year. And yet you're reviewing my incentives based on room night production, and my impact is going like this, and my evaluation of my meeting by you is going like this. So again, every other metric that the planner had, their meetings were more successful, except one, and that was contracted rooms through the traditional room block. That was a real eye-opening moment. And that client was able to very articulately and respectfully speak on behalf of this concept, not on behalf of our organization, on behalf of the concept in our industry. And then the second thing, I will never forget a budget presentation when I was with our chairman of the board, who just, again, happened to be a hotelier. And looking across the table, the CFO of the county said, I just don't get it. Every revenue you guys have is on a stellar trajectory, and yet your metrics, one of the three metrics you're providing in support of asking for more money for the 5th year in a row, is going the opposite direction. How is that possible? And so we just clearly had a very honest conversation. Room blocks are becoming irrelevant based on the technology that Junior spoke to, and he just simply said, well, then we have to find a better way, because you guys are kicking ass. And yet your metric that you're putting forward for our evaluation of our contract with you shows the opposite. And the eyes of the general manager from the Marriott Hotel just got big, and he got it. And so we created a local champion. And so this sort of perfect storm of our contract entity getting the economics of what we do, the planner's very relevant perspective, and then this aha moment of our hotelier, it was the chairman of our board, really helped. And I think given those circumstances, that conversation is replicable.
So Junior, what about you in Anaheim? How walk us through how you got buy-in.
Yeah, so happy to do that. So we've been using economic impact, attendance, all of these other metrics, in addition to room night, for 6 years now, right? And for us, similar to what Scott talked about, is it started with our annual groups. So the same trajectory that Scott talked about, our annual groups were coming in every year, and they were growing everywhere from 5 to 7 to 8% on attendance every single year. Yet their room night was either going, or it was either flat, but most of the time they were going down, right? And so that started the conversation with us, right? And so we got a champion in some of our annual groups, but we also found a champion within our destination, right? Some of our hoteliers said, the marketplace has shifted. We're looking at for food and beverage now, right? We need to monetize our events a little bit different. And so we started looking at all of our annuals, not just one annual, but an aggregate, right? At the same time we were having this discussion, we also then formulated a committee, if you will. And some of you guys in your local market have task force, sales committee, right? So we started looking at that. At the same time, we had a couple of groups that came in and said, hey, we are going to contract just for our staff and just for for some of our major exhibitors. The rest of our attendees, they can figure it out, right? And so we had a couple of groups that come into our destination that utilize almost the entire convention center short-term booking, and 80% of their attendees, most of our hotels were used by this group, right? And every single one of our hotels, like, that was the best piece of business that we got, right? And so that became sort of the catalyst for us to continue to look at this, right? So that sales and marketing task force for me helped, and there was somebody on our board, helped us make the pitch to the board. Again, we've been doing this for 6 years now, made the pitch to the board, recognizes that groups are bringing in total impact to the destination, but also different forms of revenue that hotels are picking up on, right? And that allowed us to move into this, into where we are today, looking at business different and evaluating that business a little bit different.
And when you report, Junior, your regular report about sales production and progress, what metrics are you using as you're reporting?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit, it's a number of events, right?
Number of events.
Number of events, the economic impact of those events, and then we have a slew of crossover goals, right? So these are short-term bookings, right? A-rated bookings, as we rate all of the business that are coming in, right? And we use different metrics to rate the business that's coming in, because one of the other challenges that we ran into, and I'm sure all of you guys experience this, is we would send out leads, and we think it's great leads, but hotels were turning it down, right? Or like, yeah, we're going to punt this, we're going to go to it with another one, or get another one, right? So we needed to be on the same page in terms of what the business that we're pursuing, right, for efficiency, and then also what business we're turning down. So that's another metric that we look at. So when I report out to the board, to your question, is those are some economic impact, number of events, all of our crossover goals, short-term bookings, long-term bookings, A-rated bookings are some of the things that we talked about in our board. When we report to the city and some of our members, it's a different metric that we use. Some of it are the same, but then we then start to look at attendance, economic impact, especially when we're talking to our city officials.
If I had the privilege of working with Junior as a consultant years ago when Junior was on this journey. And so, one of the things I thought I would do is share some of the things I do in the consulting engagements around strategy and around stakeholder engagement, and how do we bring our stakeholders to the table. And even though I do this in the consulting, many of you can do this right with your sales committee, starting with them and then the executive committee or to the board. But these are things that I think that everyone can kind of do on your own. You don't necessarily need a consultant for this kind of work. And one of the fundamental questions that I take to the sales committee is really about what does success look like? And really asking and engaging them in this conversation, because, and I think it was maybe Peter Drucker who said, people support what they help to create. So fundamentally, how you engage your sales committee in that conversation, whatever markets you're talking about, this fundamental question is, what does success look like? And, I think we do have to make the case, right? We do have to help our communities really understand what the current performance looks like. So I'm just going to show you a couple of slides here. So, and this is just an example. So when I show a production, and this is consumed room nights per se, by arrival date, and by glancing at this particular destination, you would conclude that 2018 is a successful year. But my contention is that the room nights alone may not from a strategy perspective, tell the whole story. So what is behind, and some of the things you could do is take a look at this from a room night perspective, and then let's decompose that. And we can decompose it by looking at another metric, number of events that Junior has alluded to. And you can apply the number of events by decomposing or breaking it down into other categories. So I've taken this example of the peak room. So it's not just the total number of events, but it's the number of events by size. And you can also look at this instead of peak rooms, you can look at this by attendance. And so when you start to break down the number of events historically that have occurred in your destination, you can kind of see what the composition is. And one thing that stakeholders or hoteliers appreciate and understand is the mix of business that's required to create a successful year. And not that more is better, but today it's about being a little more strategic and about what type of business are we looking for in any given year. So what this is illustrating is zeroing in on some of the larger groups. And you'll note that 2018 was the most successful year. It had nearly the most number of groups, but definitely the most number of room nights. But when you start to look at other performance measures, especially ones that are monitored by the hotel community, you could see that occupancy didn't necessarily line up with the DMO's most successful year in terms of room nights. And it had better performance measures in terms of ADR in 2019 than it did in 2018. And we look and zero in on what is the composition that has changed from year to year. And so the benefit of doing this is to open up this dialogue about what can we figure out with the hotel community as the ideal mix of business, and using events as a metric and events by size to categorize it. So the collaborative part of that we work with is we give the hotels and roundtables to sort of figure this out, like fill in this chart based upon their own knowledge of the business that they've hosted, and also about what years have been most successful and why. So when you're able to establish what a success looks like and come together on a mix like you would uncover in this category, then you can apply this for future years. So now when I can take this and then now I use what I've termed as the target year progress report as a KPI or a key performance indicator to monitoring future years, I could take that target, I use the past 3 years as a reference point, and then I can look across the future and see from strategy, when am I going to meet this mix, or what years I might not. And it's a little bit more of a targeted approach. It's a different conversation with your hoteliers than if you're only looking at one metric for the year, which is definite room nights. So I just shared this approach as one way in which you can begin to engage your stakeholders into more of a conversation that speaks to different metrics to define really what does success look like. And, you know, we always say more isn't necessarily better.
Yeah, I think to build on that, Shimo, is I think in the past, as you talked about, bigger was always more desired, right? So like the bigger the event, that's what we wanted, right? And so going through this experience, or going through this exercise with our hotels and Shimo sort of guiding us through it, we really developed a way for us to evaluate business beyond just looking at the total rooms, right? So we looked at everything from seasonality to food and beverage to economic impact to room rate, and then to the cost for us to acquire that piece of business that Scott talked about earlier, right? And then from there, we can then decide what is the right mix of business for us. And when we first started this exercise, our hotel community said, came back to us and said, get one citywide that's over 6,000 rooms on peak every month for the rest of the year, right? But when we start to dive into that, these major events take so long to move in. It kills on the front end of the month. You know what I'm talking about. It kills a lot of the dates in the destination. The other component for us is seasonality, right? In the summer for us, Disney kicks up, and in your destination, you have that same seasonality. It may not be Disney, but something else, right? So when we looked at seasonality, a lot of our hotels did not want the big groups over that time because the leisure business was doing well. So again, it allowed us to have the same conversation, talking about the same metric, and then measuring the right the valuation of the valuation of the business, but the right mix of business that we want for our destination every year going, and then also every year, and then also looking at even years versus odd year based on the pattern that comes into our destination.
And I think that it's so important to, we talked about annual events, right? And really being able to layer those in to make sure that we're maximizing around those annual events. So I think it's a great way to talk about the health of the destination as you move forward.
A couple of things I'd like to jump in here, Shima. I think, when we talk about how to get there, you can't eat the elephant one bite at a time, right? And so I will say there's a couple of key learnings that I had through this strategy. We still have, to this day, sitting here in Toronto, individual room night production goals for every salesperson in business events, business development. Absolutely. They're calculated, they're done, they're based on historical, they're based on market segment, they're based on geography, all of that. We have actual room night production goals for our salespeople. Those room night production goals, however, are not defined by a contracted room block, they're defined by attendees. So we use an attendance-based calculation for room night production. But our hotels love it because they have room night qualification and focus that they love. Whenever we report on our efforts, we never just show the term room nights. So when we're reporting on the efforts of our salespeople, there is always three things shown. Number of attendees is first, room demand or rooms production is second, and the number of events is third. Every single one has, there's never a time when room nights are shown by themselves. And again, getting people comfortable, showing them that there's a direct correlation between attendance and room production. And those things have helped so much in the adoption of this idea of where these 2 points connect. But again, this is not about saying room nights have no place. It's really about room nights don't have the place. They have a place in what we do. And the biggest conundrum for all of this, and this is, I think, for our industry at large to overcome, and that is that our hotels and that metric of a hotel room night has been the denominator for so many things. Our budgets as DMOs, room rebates to groups, the idea that you used to be able to have a housing room block where 80% of your attendees register and they could be assessed the $5 transportation fee. We didn't create the world where that doesn't exist, right? And
it's gone.
Recognize it's gone, right? And we, planners can lament the days of, rebates, and hotel GMs can lament the days of contracted room blocks. Well, we didn't create either of those dynamics. We have to be there to help solve them, but we didn't create them. And so I think ways of looking at the economic impact of event and what incentives you can offer based on that economic impact, I think is the future. So instead of looking at room rebates, there's a really clear way to say, if you bring X amount of attendees to my community, and 85% of those attendees are predisposed to have accommodations, an overnight stay associated with them, we can calculate what that economic impact is. And there is a very easy way to then say, this is our incentive package offered to you per attendee. There's a true up at the end. You show your registered actualized attendance, and we have a true up and say, thank you for your business. That's an easy path for us to get to, and I think solves a lot of the problems, but you're never going to get there through a room night calculation. You're only going to get there through calculating and verifying the actual impactor, and that is the attendee.
Well, Terry, You know, I'm wondering whether anyone has any questions for us. You're on mute, though. We have to say that once in every webinar, don't we?
We do. I'm going to try. Now I'm going to try to unmute Adam Papiro to see if he can talk to us, because he's had several questions / comments. So I thought maybe the best way to engage him might be to see if we can allow him to talk. Hey, Adam, are you there?
Hey, I am. Thanks, Terry. Thanks for letting me. Looks like I don't have the camera on, but can you hear me okay?
We can.
Certainly can.
Okay, so thank you for addressing the items, and sorry to have that short barrage, but obviously you really got the wheel spinning a bunch. And actually, just in that last segment, Scott really touched on a lot of it. You know, we're a destination that still, you know, facilitates citywide business with the combination of funding from our organization, some discounting at our convention center, but also we rely on the hotel rebates. So it's you know, there are our solutions, and I recognize that there are more and more cities that have TMDs and other creative means in which to help, if necessary, to fund, you know, citywide activities. But I appreciate Scott talking about that. And then, so the rebate thing, I don't know that I've completely solved it, but we clearly, like he said, we didn't create this. We just have to be a part of the solution. The other side of it was the measurement of individual sales team performance. And it really got me thinking. And as Junior was talking about the various metrics, particularly those crossover goals, I was interested in seeing, and it might be something we take offline, but how you could creatively incorporate some of that, because we've done things to incent our team or incentivize our team to focus on need periods, obviously, and placing business where we need it most, and work that in creatively with our goals. But I was just interested if there were other measurements that are now being incorporated beyond the traditional room night goal for the incentive programs. Thanks.
Yep. So I can jump in there, Shimo, right? So in terms of our incentive programs, definite booking is one of them, but all of it, to Adam's question, all of the crossover metrics that we have are part of our incentive program, right? They're just weighted very differently. Right, so I'm happy to share that with you as a one-off, Adam. But all of those crossover metrics that we talked about are part of our incentive program. The big metric for us is the event, right, and the economic impact and attendance of that event, right. But then there's short-term, A-rated, you know, large-size events, right. They're all part of our incentive program.
So, Junior, you're able to, you know, set targets for the number of events you need for future years from your team.
Yeah, it's the idea of having multiple gas pedals, if you will, right? So if, for example, we really have a need in the next 3 years, then we weigh that a little bit more than, you know, a group further down the line, right? If we are looking for a group, you know, larger size groups, right, to anchor parts out of our months that need business, we would put more weighting into that, right? So it's the idea of being able to adjust the weighting and adjust the incentive based on our needs.
All right, Adam, anything else at this point?
Just thank you for another amazing webinar. I appreciate it.
Thanks for being with us, Adam. And I was looking to see if Andreas was on the call from DI, but he isn't. But do you know if DI plans to make any adjustments to their economic impact calculator that reflects the KPI discussion and market adjustments change in room demand? Is a question from Nancy Breed.
Good question. And I'm not aware of any major changes in that. I think we have to always be cognizant of what we're asking tools to do for us. That particular tool is really geared to develop algorithms around, you know, that spend, jobs, the overall sales or the impact. And so we need to make sure that tool does that job first and foremost for us.
I would add, Terry, that there's an enormous amount of manipulation, positive term, and not used positively, or customization that one can do. I mean, Junior has spent a lot of time working the input of the EIC to get out what is relevant for his destination. I would dare say there's probably no amount of work that needs to be done on the economic impact calculator at the DI level. It's the individual destination level and understanding it better, because every one of these metrics are there. I mean, attendance is there, all of those factors are there. And I think they all relate back to one of the things that I think would be, again, this golden opportunity we have ahead of us. Before the pandemic, many of us were in the margins. We had full pipelines. We were really working on finding those right pieces for the needed pieces. We were focused on the margins. Well, we're now focused in a very different way. And so developing the way that your community ranks and values business is really important. So Junior uses ABC, we use 1 through 10, and we have developed collaboratively a way to value that business. And I know there's a lot of great work you're doing, Shimo, but to give the group a little bit of a sense, it's again, the number of attendees, but what type of attendee? It's the number of convention days used, and then room demand per convention day. And then it's ancillary spend. And those 5 things, oh, and then lead time booking. So 6 qualifications, how far in advance, and sort of that idea of need period evaluation. Those things have allowed us to create a matrix that allows us to assign a number. And then all of our associated incentives, any other concessions we offer, scale up based on that number that's assigned or the value that group is assigned. So when you have a 10, there's no stopping the size of the check we write. If you have a 2, you really question whether that's the right type of business to be offering any additional concessions to. We never say no, but we're not going to incent a group that's a 2 versus a 10. And that individual qualification of what makes that group work is, as you said, there's a great quote you used about having people just define the process. If you're in there with your community, they can define it fairly easily.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to combine a couple of questions. So this is about capturing metrics. So first of all, where are you recording registered attendees after the event, and what methods are you using to verify past attendance and room blocks, since data collection is kind of inconsistent? So where are you recording the actual registration of the attendees after the event? And then what methods are you using to verify past attendance?
I guess I would challenge the idea that it's inconsistent. We always use the planner, who was the event producer. We use their number, and we load it in our CRM like you do pickup rooms. We have a number of guests that we load in our CRM that's then put up to Mint. And I will tell you, Terry, I know this is about citywides, but that number of guests is definitive at the hotel level as well, because the BEO says how many guests were there and how many were served. So the attendee number, there's no inconsistency from my experience of using the actual planner to get that number. And I think they're much more willing than people think to give you that number. And or in an individual hotel, the banquet team can tell you exactly how many people were there. And so those numbers have been very rarely to be inconsistent from my perspective, always loaded in our CRM and always loaded post-event as well as in advance.
Yeah, I think the question, Terry, where do you store it, is a great question, because I often was challenged on where in the system do we store that, especially in SimpleView. So we store it in if you know where the profile is and history, future history, that's where we store it. The field label says total attendance, but because it's history, right? So we assume that's where it is. It's not necessarily labeled that way in SimpleView, right? And to Scott's point, in terms of attendance for us, we get this number from the convention center, but we also ask the organizer, right? How many badges did you print, right? It's sort of the easiest way for us to ask that question, right? Because some organizers may count it different. They count it by total attendance per day and then aggregate that, right? So how many badges did you print is usually a fairly simple, straightforward question. So there's no duplication in the count of attendance. And to Scott's point, you know, the hotels have that number in terms of people coming in, and certainly the convention center has that number when we started the process.
And again, I probably need to be a little bit more specific. Any meeting profile in SimpleView that's a past event, it's that number of attendance that we update based on feedback from the planner. And then if it's bidding for a future event, we just ask the planner for the 3-year history of registered attendees, or as Junior put it, badges printed. Some get the badges printed, some have registered attendance, and you can find some pretty good ways of validating that. I mean, we've had to go as far as, Instead of calling your fellow hotelier and saying, hey, how good did this group pick up? We go online and read their press releases. You can find a lot of information. You can actually corroborate a lot of the information with the way they talk about their event. And you can usually find out that you're within a really good sort of consistent number.
And Junior, you're going back to really update those attendance numbers after the fact, right?
For actuals, yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's
Because
what I
it allows us to track history, right?
All right. Of course, Kelly Sailing has too many questions for me to answer. So I'm going to have to, okay, Kelly, I'm coming for you. I'm going to unmute you. Kelly.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Terry. Junior Scott Shimo, thank you. And you're right, it was like my notes, Terry, into that. Sorry about that. I actually only have 2 questions at this point. And one of them is, wouldn't it be great to talk about demand again? So this is certainly not a problem for today, but long-term, have there been groups that have concern about not blocking core contracts? So are they concerned that if they're not required, for example, by a destination to produce a peak and a total of rooms in terms of contracts, that they then wouldn't have wide availability for their delegates?
We're not saying you can't block it. We're just saying that's not how we measure the success of the event. I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, both here in Toronto, pre-pandemic, and in Salt Lake, there were groups that said to us, very similar to what Junior said, we only going to want to block speakers and key exhibitors, and the other 5,000 people are on their own. We've had the exact inverse as well. In a smaller market like Salt Lake, people said, it's too risky for us to bring 5,000 people without protecting room blocks, so we're going to do it. We've just never said you had to or not. If the planner wanted to do that, that was absolutely up to the planner to do. But regardless of what the planner chose to do, we weren't going to evaluate the meeting based off of the contract room block.
I just wonder if their behavior changed, but I get your point. And I guess the other thing is, have you had feedback, and this one makes me sort of roll my eyes, but have you had feedback from intermediaries who don't want to focus on your destinations due to contracted blocks not being required? And I hear you that you're not evaluating on that metric, but if it's not required to access key dates or space, are they less of an advocate for your destination in that case, because of course it affects their payment structure?
No.
Nope.
No.
Good.
Because we're not. I think there's been a misunderstanding here that I want to kind of clarify, Kelly, is we're not saying you can't block rooms. That's not any at all. And we can clearly evaluate the size of your room block with this metrics. It's just no longer put as the measure of our effectiveness as an organization to our community.
I do understand that, Scott. I just think that there are cities that require a certain amount, of course, in order for access to key space.
Sure,
so if that's not required, they may choose to be more risk adverse or whatever, and the intermediary might be in opposition of their what they want to happen.
I'll tell you, I love competing against those kind of cities.
Oh yeah.
I love it because we win and the intermediary makes more money by booking our destination because we are easier to work with.
Right. Yeah, and Kelly, we've been doing this for 6 years and we haven't had that issue. Right. So don't know.
Good.
You know, and I always say, Kelly, you know, that booking guidelines, which is what you're speaking to, the requirement of booking X amount of contracted rooms in order to, you know, have 150,000 gross square feet of space or whatever, you know, that should never dictate your strategy. It should be kind of a safety net, but it should not come into play if you're really deploying your strategy efficiently.
Well, nor should an intermediary steer business that way.
Right.
You're based.
It shouldn't. Yeah. It should inform your decision, not make your decision for you. Right.
That's right.
Well, I know we're at the top of the hour. I have some questions that didn't get answered, but I'll just maybe bring this last one to Junior and Shimo. When you were talking about rating business A, B, C, can you talk a little bit about the metrics that were used for processing those kinds of decisions?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. Right. So for us, it was important for us to have your large hotels, your mid-sized hotels, and your smaller hotels in this conversation. In fact, I have a meeting with our hotels next month to revisit this, because obviously things have changed, right? So we're going to revisit our strategy and look at the metrics that we use to rate the business and validate that that's still the right metrics, right? So the metric that we use is, as Scott talked about, the cost for us to acquire business, right? Whether that's incentives, whatever it is, rebates, what is the cost for us to acquire that piece of business? Food and beverage is another metric that we look at, right? Seasonality, right? For us, summer business is different than, winter business or Q1 versus Q2 versus Q4, right? So we look at that. Economic impact of the business, right? So obviously the bigger business is going to have a bigger economic impact. And I'll talk a little bit how we normalize that, right? And then the last metric that we use is rooms rate, right? So hotel room rate, right? So do we want to match what we did in 2019? Do we want to get back to what we did in 2019, right? So all of those metrics, what we then do is weight those metrics. So some may be weighted at 20 or 30 or 40%, right? To give more emphasis to the type of business that we want, right? And in all of that, we get, you do the mathematical equation, right? And it gives you a number in the end, right? And then we look at those numbers for the groups that all of our hotels come back and say, this is the kind of business that we want every single time, right? And usually those are the business that's going to be rated a little bit higher, right? So that's the process that we go through. And again, we want this discussion to be representative of all of our entire destination. So from smaller hotels, right, that we need when we go after that mega group, right, to the large boxes that really consume, that really work off, that live off of the citywide business, right? So that's the process that we go through in rating. And then it's an ongoing conversation with our sales leaders from all of our hotels, right? Because some sales leaders will say, no, we'll turn that down. Then it's myself or some of our team members will get on the phone and say, okay, why and this group is rated A based on our own rating metrics, right? So it's an ongoing conversation. Usually we revisit that every quarter for us.
And what Junior really speaks of is that he's established a common definition of what good business looks like. And that's what event scoring is all about. So what he's identified when he says cost, seasonality, these are all criteria of that each of those criteria get weighted in a scoring system. So in a future webinar, I know that Terry is going to want to talk about the event scoring profile, which is a new tool inside of Mint that is being released. And so stay tuned for hearing more about that.
And if you are a Mint subscriber, this is not a commercial because we're not selling anything. It's a free tool inside the Mint system. But if you're interested in learning more about event scoring and specifically having access, having access to the event scoring profile calculator, please just shoot me a little email and I'll be happy to set up a time to review that with you. All right. Great job.
Well, I want to thank all of you for being part of our conversation today. It's a very important topic, and Scott and Junior, both of you, for sharing your experiences and your knowledge around this topic, because we certainly do need to move away from the sole focus of room nights. Thank you, and everyone, have a great day.
Thank you.